go. There you go. And so I'd like to welcome our author this month. We read this wonderful book, A Girl Called Samson. I know it's backwards because everything's backwards on this camera. And we have with us Amy Harmon. Amy's right there in the right-hand corner of my screen. Hello, Amy, and welcome.
Hello.
I want to thank you on behalf of all of us for bringing this incredible story to light and to life. Because I mean, I was there. Your writing just put me there in the middle of these battles and getting shot and all those wonderful things. And I just, thank you. I think I really enjoyed the read. And so before we get started, I'd like for you just to give us a little bit overview, if you would. I know there's some author notes in the back of what sort of inspired you to write this wonderful story of Deborah Sampson, and what things you learned as you took on the project. Because I can just tell by your writing that she got deeper and deeper as we got into the story.
Oh boy, what inspired me? It's always one of those things that's hard to pinpoint, because inspiration is kind of like pulling on a thread, and then you start to all of these threads start to unravel. But it was the 4th of July of all days, the 4th of July 2021, and her story came up. A story about her came up on a women's magazine, online magazine that I follow, and it was basically about women of the Revolution. And I taught American history to 6th and 7th graders, so I'm fairly well versed. And I did not know Deborah Sampson, and I was like, "That's odd. Who's this?" And immediately kind of went down a rabbit hole. And by the end of the week, I had written up a proposal for my publisher. I knew that I needed to, that was the story I wanted to immerse myself in. And there was nothing fictional of this type, where fiction and fact kind of come together in story form. There was nothing like that about her. There were some young adult books about her that were, story form, but nothing that encompassed really the whole woman, or what I felt like was the whole woman. And I just, from that point on, my publisher agreed pretty quickly, amazingly enough. And that was where it all began, 4th of July.
And you hadn't written a word. You just told your publisher, "I want to do this," and gave them a proposal for it.
I had to write up a proposal, and
Right.
Sometimes writing a proposal is as hard as, not as hard, but it's you have to do a lot of work to even come up with a proposal. It's a thesis basically.
Exactly.
So a couple, basically convincing them of the merits of writing this book and writing it the way I write, meaning fiction. So they agreed, but it only took me a week to come up with the proposal also, which is, for me, is absolutely unheard of. It's months usually coming up with a proposal. First of all, deciding what I want to write, that's always hard. And then putting it in, getting enough through the story that you can then write a cohesive, proposal from A to Z on what this story is going to entail. And so, it was a very unique experience in that way. And it ended up being a very unique experience all the way through it.
Yeah, it's a little different than what some of your other writing too. I mean, I think this, maybe I'm wrong. I've read a number of your books, not all of them, but I think it's my favorite of all yours so far. But I found myself just relating to Deborah, experiencing her in her emotion in so many ways as we followed her journey, and with so much missing about her character. Were there other women figures that you kind of drew from to create her, or did she just sort of progress as you wrote her from the research that you've done? Any thoughts on how you were able to bring this woman to light with, as we all know, so much missing in women's lives from these periods of time?
Yeah, there isn't a whole lot.
Right.
I read everything I could on Deborah Sampson, first of all, just to get a feel. And and then I read a lot of work that wasn't about her, but was about the revolution and about the times. So the people of the times. And she really came, I don't like to use these words because a lot of times they're off-putting to people, but there is something that happens when you start to really delve and you really start to research. There's a channeling feeling that starts to happen, at least for me. And I know that the historical times, and in this case, this real woman who and I think maybe the difference that you felt is I have never written my historical fiction. I've never quite done it with a real woman that is the main character that is telling the story, first person. And so I really felt like I had to have a grip on who she was. And I feel like I did. I felt like I really had a feel for Deborah Sampson going in, and then it just continued to build. Like you said, it continued to build as I worked harder and harder on the book. That she was very clear to me, almost the entire way. I didn't ever feel like that I lost Deborah Sampson. I knew who Deborah Sampson was, and that was very, she was very present all through the writing of this book. She was very, very real to me.
Well, it's interesting when you say that, because there was a minute when I'm reading, right, and I read quick, and I, as Avery knows, I'll just jam through a book in a day and a half, and because I can't put them down usually, and if I can't put them down, that's a problem. But for me, I had difficulty at times seeing Deborah as a woman, particularly when she, once she took on the identity of this Robert Shurtleff individual that she created, right? And I mean, I was like, okay, wait a minute, is this a 16-year-old boy I'm reading, or is this a woman? I mean, I had a tough time as a reader, and I can't imagine the time you had as a writer doing that, but you did a great job of convincing us, or at least me, that, she had indeed had assumed this identity and this person, and had become him, but not wanting to give up, Deborah Sampson, the female part, but the old part. I mean, it was a really interesting essay, if you will, on identity, I think. And I think, did you have trouble? My question to you is, did you struggle with that? Who were you? Where was she in this process? When was she Robert Shurtleff? When was she not? And then bouncing back and forth and becoming that identity.
Honestly, I did not have any trouble at all with that. Because she was Deborah. For me, she was just Deborah. And I think sometimes with some of these identity questions, and there is that we forget that each person is very unique, a very unique individual. And she was very much Deborah. And I didn't struggle. And I honestly don't think Deborah struggled with this. I think Deborah, there was the struggle with the mores of the time and the roles, the very, very distinct roles of the time, and what you could do and what you couldn't do. And she talks about that struggle. But she says to John Patterson at one point, I'm not trying to be anything that I'm not. I'm trying to be who I am. And who she was more than the box that society or culture or history or whatever, what have you. We're all, depending on whether we're women or men, or we're put in boxes, or historically we were put in boxes. I still think we are. But she was Deborah, and I think she knew who she was. And the scrappy soldier was very much a part of who she was, which is why she didn't have why she was successful, was because it was very much genuine. It wasn't a costume. It was very, Robert Shurtleff was Deborah. They were one and the same. And so, yeah, she had to hide her womanhood, but I don't think she had to disguise herself. if that makes sense.
Mhm. Okay, so I'm going to leave you here. I've got a couple more questions for you, but I'm going to hold them and give other folks a chance to jump in, because I know there's some folks here that have lots of questions for you. So I'll just give you guys the floor for a few minutes. Anybody want to have a question they want to ask? If not, I'll continue with my list. Miriam, did I see your hand go up? No.
Well, I was scratching my ear, but my hand was gonna go.
Oh, your hand was going to go up. I figured. I was looking at my screen here. Who's got their hand up?
Who's gonna jump in first? Okay, so Amy, thank you very much for joining us. I have to say I really, really loved your book, and I just wrote a review on it, and I told people not to read the author's note at the end because, well, it definitely spoils it. So I had a question. Why did you pick an epistolary and diary narrative? What made you decide to have Deborah tell her story with letters and diary entries as opposed to just a straight narrative?
That's a great question, and it's one of those things that I think the hardest part of writing any story is figuring out how to tell the story, and where the story begins, and how you wrap in, especially with historical fiction, how you wrap in the history and the times and the setting without an in the beginning type of thing. Because where does the story start? And Deborah's story, the part that made her a historical figure was the war period, and so that had to be very central. But you wouldn't have understood Deborah at all if we would have just started with her signing up. We had to know what made her do the things she did, what formed her, who she was, that she would then do something that was very unlikely. And I had to really think about, how do I tell this story? How do I give people a sense of the history of the times and Deborah Sampson, and at the same time, get to the point quickly enough that I don't lose people? And that's, this was really challenging, putting all that, a lifetime, this little girl, it starts really at when she's the opening scene is a letter, but then she's 10 years old. And that was that's when she went to the Thomas family with all these boys, and so formative. But I had a lot to get in, so that people understood Deborah Sampson. And then, we go all the way at the end, we all go all the way to, 15 years, 20 years after the war, which was an important part of her story too. But how do I do this? And so it came up actually in my research, a little thread, and this is how it often works, but this thread where she did have a pen pal of sorts, another woman who wrote to her, and that was arranged by Reverend Conant. And so that was true. And it was just a little piece of, something that I'd found when I was doing my research. And I thought it was like an immediate, now that's interesting. And John was very much a part of her war years. I immediately, there was an immediate connection as far as their relationship was very deep. The research I found, it was, they glide over everything, but there's things that even when they're kind of glossed over, you can feel they have a resonance. So there was a really strong feel. I had a really strong feeling that was maybe the most important relationship in her life was John Patterson. And I know people have struggled with the end notes, like the disappointment of what wasn't true, but so much of the story was true. And even though I gave her an ending or a relationship, and it wasn't even a relation, the relationship was real. It was just I gave it a little more, but the whole all of that was tied together. Like, how do I tell this story? And I loved loved working in Elizabeth Patterson. I loved giving her a much bigger role than she would have had. She wouldn't have had a role at all if I'd have just stayed with the war period, and after the war she would add very little impact. So by involving her as this correspondent that Deborah really did have, we don't know who she was. I was able to create a history with John Patterson, which was important to where I went with the story. And also Elizabeth served as kind of this, almost like this other narration, because she was kind of this very, very real and very, very big role in this book, but it was not the role that people would have anticipated. So, and she represented kind of one of the revolutionary women. She kind of represented the revolutionary woman. Deborah fought, but the story was really about a lot of different women of the revolution, and she kind of encompassed, that the character of the woman that stayed at home and kept everything together. So yeah, it was one of those things that kind of just, once I finally decided upon it, it felt like the right path.
Well, it surely draws you in to the story. And I'd completely forgotten at the end that it was almost a complete flashback where she was telling the story of her life. So you did a really excellent, I really enjoyed that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Janet, you have your hand up, darling.
Well, I just want to say that I love almost all your books. I've read a few of them, and I love this story. I love any story where a woman, really kind of bucks the trend.
Yes,
And she really bucked the trend at a time when women just did not do that. And yeah, I too was kind of disappointed when I read your author's note. I really kind of wanted that whole bodice ripper part to become true.
Yes, I just did that for Deborah because I think Deborah would have liked for the bodice ripper part to be true too.
Yeah, and the part where, well, was any of it? So my question too was the part where she gets yellow fever as she's walking around in the breeches and all. Is any of that true, or is that
all true? It's all true.
That is true.
Yes.
Oh, wow.
The only part really.
I was like, well, that was stupid, man. She really screwed it up.
No, all of that's true. The way she was found out in the hospital, how she almost died of yellow fever. All of that's true.
That part was true.
Honestly, the only thing that isn't true is that she married John Patterson.
Right. She never.
The rest of the book is, I think, even including this really, really deep friendship. And John Patterson, I do think they loved each other. Now, do I think they had a romantic relationship? No, John Patterson was married to Elizabeth Patterson, and he went home to Elizabeth Patterson. She didn't die.
No, she never died.
Yeah. But even from the beginning, I thought, yes, but I know all that, but this is the way that I'm going to tell this story. Yeah. So, and I know people. Yeah, I know people struggled with how you killed Elizabeth. I think Elizabeth's okay with it. I think Elizabeth got a big part. I didn't really kill Elizabeth. I didn't affect her life at all. So the real Elizabeth, I think, was given a very special role, and I did that on purpose too, because it really helped tell this story and fill in a lot of the blanks between what was a lot of truth, just so much truth. John Patterson's father died of yellow fever. All of those odd truths, these odd connections that make a story so wonderful, and that you have to kind of glean from history and then kind of mold into a narrative. There was just so much truth that almost everything is true. When people are like, well, what about, nope, that is too, it was that constant, so many truths. It was just that she didn't get John Patterson. They remained friends for the rest of their lives. Yeah, she didn't get to marry him. He was
Do you-
wonderful though.
Do you know, did you say, did she marry anybody? Did she
She
have
did.
kids? She did.
Yeah,
She
a
married
few-
no one else.
yes,
Yeah.
a few years after the war. So it wasn't somebody she knew. And that was another problem. No matter what, and you said, well, don't give her a romance. But I wanted to. I mean, that's
Amy, you're a romantic
that's-
writer at heart. Come on.
Right. At heart, I have to have the love story there. And I do feel like there was such a connection there that I knew immediately that it was him. And yet I was like, oh, how do I do this? But she didn't meet the man that she married until after the war. He did not serve. He was not a soldier. I don't know what kind of man he was. I got the sense from the history when I read it that she kind of was in the same old role of indentured servant, from what I could glean. He just, she took care of him like she taken care of everyone else. But there wasn't much there. And I thought, okay, well, no matter what I do, I'm going to have to create. There's going to have to be some fictionalization because the pieces are too, he just wasn't he wasn't a part of the war story, which was the story. So yeah, I'm sorry about the disappointment. But I had to set the record straight at the end.
I had to remember that it is historical fiction. So
The fiction part, right.
yeah.
All right. Thanks, Janet. Carol, and Carol, by the way, is a docent up in Deborah's home. She can tell you all about it. So,
Oh, wonderful.
No. So where are you from?
I am from I'm from the West. I'm way out West here. Yeah.
Okay.
A little town.
So have you been to Massachusetts, to Deborah Sampson's house?
I have not been to her house. I have been
Okay,
to Massachusetts, but I have not been to her
This
house.
is actually in front of the Sharon Memorial Library.
Mhm.
And I've lived three places in the last 45 years, 30 years in Sharon and 5 years in Middleborough. So Deborah Sampson is like somebody who
I imagine she is. Yeah.
So I want to say that I loved the book. I didn't read it all because I ordered it and it just came a few days ago. So I've been like diligent and reading. But first of all, I want to say because of the fact that I lived in Sharon for all those years and I was a member of the Historical Society, I've seen her uniform, everything. And my son worked on his Eagle Scout project, involved her second part of her life, the farm in Sharon where she lived, and she married Benjamin Gannett. But I didn't know a lot about her childhood. And I love the whole beginning of the book because it really has filled in so much. I mean, I know about it, but I've also had a student in my class that portrayed it. I don't want to go into detail. Like I know a lot about it. But anyway, I loved it, but I loved the letters. And I didn't get to the end and I didn't read the author's note yet. So I wasn't sure if she was real or not, but sometimes when you read a book like this, letters, it gets to be too much back and forth, but this was just the perfect amount of letters and they came at the right time. But I really loved that she kept writing them to her after she died. And it was almost like a journal, but in a different form. I love your writing. I oftentimes I write myself. I hate when people have unrealistic similes, but I think yours really went so well. I've enjoyed it. I've learned a lot. And I was wondering which part was fictional. That was one of the things I was going to ask. So I think you have talked about that. So the other thing that I would like to ask is, would you think about a sequel? Because, and also you should be sending a copy to the Sharon Historical Society, or if you want to send me a copy, I'll bring it over there.
Yeah.
Because they will go crazy and they'll even sell it. I know all the board members. But in any
Very
event,
cool.
I want to just say that the next part of her life, when she wants to get reparations she never gets paid for her service,
Yeah.
as you know, and she gets hurt, and she finally, in the second part of her life, after she gets married and has all these children, lived on the farm in Sharon, and goes out on a lecture tour all over with her story, would be such a wonderful second half of this story. Now, I am friends with the people who live in her house, in her farmhouse. So if you
Wow.
decide, I'll introduce you. One of my best friends, it's her brother and sister-in-law who live in her farm house, and I've been there many times. But in any event, I just think that part of the story, as far as women's suffrage goes, because she goes into the 1800s, like, I just think it would be so fabulous to do sort of like a sequel, because she does really fall in love, and she does have all these lecture tours that she does, and does get her due with what she deserved for being in the service.
Right. Yeah.
So,
I know the lecture tour, and that does, I actually do cover that at the end of the book.
Yeah, she
So,
does.
oh, you do? Okay.
Yeah,
I didn't
that part was really important, and I recognize that it was, but and there is a big lifespan there. So I do bring that in. So make sure you get
all right. I'm sorry.
you get to the end. Yeah, no
And
problem. But
Carol,
but
I'm
it is
happy.
important. You're right.
I'm happy to send Amy your contact information, if she wants to reach out in terms of getting a book.
Absolutely, I would love it. And I give tours of the Freedom Trail, so we share I give tours of the Freedom Trail, so we share a lot about loving revolutionary people. So
yes,
anyway,
that's
so
wonderful.
thanks for coming, and thanks for a great book. I put aside Marie Benedict's First Ladies to finish reading
And
this.
she's your favorite, we know. Lisa, you got a question? Thanks.
Yeah, hi Amy. I loved the book as well, and just such an interesting character. I've got probably more comments than anything else, but I loved how towards the end where you had her connect with Elizabeth's children through the reading of the letters. I thought that was so special. And you had so many good quotes in this book. And one of my favorites was something like something to be treasured or a treasure. One is valued and one is possessed. I just thought that was so cool. I don't know if that was your quote or if you got that from somebody.
That's mine.
That was your quote?
Yes, I
loved it.
Yeah, thank you. My sister actually loved that one as well. So
yeah, I thought it was very special. And then the only other thing I thought was, if there was somebody like a Deborah who did this, I wonder how many other Deborahs tried something like this, either through the Revolutionary War or the Civil War. I wonder if you came across any sort of story somewhere else that maybe another woman tried to do this.
There were other women that tried, but as far as I know, she was the only one who was successful and made it. And actually, she wasn't. She wasn't for the lack of a word. She was light infantry, so it wasn't just that she was, run of the mill. She wasn't a cook. She wasn't serving, and she wasn't just an orderly or something of that. She was light infantry, which was, was pretty incredible because they were a more elite soldier, and yet her skills, and she marvels at the fact that she knows that she's not as strong. She recognizes the differences, but for whatever reason, the things that she was able to do and the skills that she had developed in her life served her well. And she was number one thing was she was extremely determined and was just like, I'm gonna make it through this. And she was so driven. I tried to capture why that would be and who she was, but yeah, that was a pretty intense. And there is there are some Civil War women that did this during the Civil War. I don't know a lot about them, but I do know that there were women that soldiered up during the Civil War, but I don't know of anyone who was successfully served like Deborah Sampson did during the Revolution. There were some women that tried, but
interesting, in the Civil War, there's rumors here in Virginia, of course, you never know. But it's been going on since I can remember, that General George Pickett was actually a woman. I mean,
I think I've heard that.
Yeah, right. I mean, where the beard came from is it's a small beard, but
Well,
oh well. Miriam. Oh, actually, let me go to Denise first, because she hasn't spoken yet, and then I'll get you. Denise.
Thank you. Amy, I don't really have a question either. I just want to tell you how fabulous this book was. I always love a book that makes me feel, and I felt like I was falling in love with John right along with I just had all these feels, and also so many fabulous quotes. I have so much earmarked in my book, and I love the letters. Not a question. I think it was beautiful, and I just wanted you to know that I was right there. I was there with them, and that is what I look for in a book. So thank you to Sharon and Amy and the book club. It was great. So
thank you so much. You're making me have wet eyes.
Well, we had a couple reading it, right, Denise?
And I whipped through it, but I cried. I wanted to be in that river, right? Anyway, that's information, but whatever. It was great.
Thanks, Denise. All right, Miriam.
I guess I have another writing question. So I noticed that all the chapters follow the text of the Declaration of Independence. Was that something that the editors suggested, or was that something that you came up with? Because it was really wonderful to see that theme run through the book, because that was who Deborah was.
Yeah, exactly. It was her the book was really Deborah's Declaration of Independence. And so it was such a marvelous, she was such a marvelous character for the time. Her story it wasn't just about the time she lived in, but it was about her own journey so much. And no, my editors didn't. I have a thing with chapter titles. Not many people do much with chapter titles anymore, and I still love them. If you've read some of my other books, there's just something about packaging things with a little bit of something special. And I don't remember when I came up with the idea to use the Declaration of Independence in the chapter titles, but so many people have missed that. But that was really fun to just think, okay, what is this chapter about, and try to use them chronologically, but using a phrase that kind of worked for that chapter that was from the language of the Declaration. And it was just a fun little thing and I have a thing for chapter titles. So I'm glad you noticed.
Yeah. I also loved all the quotes from Proverbs and Psalms. They were just so spot on as something that is so common to our prayers and our thoughts. And I just love the way that you worked that into a lot of the text. So,
thank you. Yeah, I think my
publishers
struggled with that, honestly.
Right.
Really?
Yeah. It's American history. We're in a strange place in our country now where we can't even really acknowledge this is history, and with all its warts and everything. And I just don't. They struggled. I didn't know if this book would end up getting published. Honestly, they agreed to it, and then when I wrote it and turned it in, they were like, "Oh, this isn't quite what we thought it was going to be. And I think the language and the feel of the time, I couldn't leave out that scriptural part, because if you know anything about history and you know anything about her story, it was a really big part of her education, and a big part of most people's education at the time. It was the book that every family had. And so the language of scripture, which she would have been brought up on, and yet she was very much her own. She had her own belief system and her own faith and her own all of that. So I had to kind of stick to my guns on all of those things, because it was Deborah. And I said, I'm sorry, I'm going to leave. I have to leave these things in, because this is the time she lived, and these are the things that formed her. And they struggled with it. It was a battle right up to the end. So again, I'm really glad that you appreciated the bits of Proverbs and things that she used to kind of form her own faith.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that was one of my questions, or one of my points I was going to bring up. I've looked at some of the reviews, and I've had similar issues with the reviews on my new book. Is someone speaking? Anyway, those issues are, the religious connotations, the religious quotes, the scripture that's being referenced. And as you said, 1776, 1783, my book is coming out, it's 1872. It's all the same, right? I mean, religion was a huge part of social society. Our country was built on, one nation under God. And yet you get a lot of criticism. I've seen some of your write-ups, and people like, oh, I didn't realize she was going to, give me a lecture on faith or on religion, or this is a religious book, and you've got a lot of criticism for it, as have I've seen with some of the early reviews of mine. So it's just interesting. My publisher stood by me and didn't give me a hard time, but I'm not surprised that you got that, Amy.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you stuck with your guns, because to take that out would be to undermine the actual character and the feeling of the time.
And the history, the actual history. You have to you have to stick with those things that are true to the time, and that tell the story. It would have gutted the story. You wouldn't have understood Deborah in the same way without those things, and the strength she drew from it, but also the permission almost she drew from it. As she read, she was like, these are the things that inspired me and guided me and led me, and she definitely had her own brand of faith and her own brand of religion. I mean, she questions it, but it was still a formative part of her life.
Yeah, I concur. And as you said, to remove those things, just to be politically correct in today's times, is just, it undermines the story, and it's not why we write. We're trying to put you there. And if we take something out that might be offensive to some people, then you're not there. And I'm not going to back down either. So I appreciate the fact that you stood by your guns on that.
Thank you.
Yeah. And Janet's got an interesting comment. Janet says, that she wasn't offended. So there you go. Some of the folks in the chats, right? I mean, it's just
I'm Jewish. I wasn't offended by it at all. I mean, that's the way people were then. I don't know what the comments are, but why people have to make, everybody's got a thing these days.
Yeah,
everybody's
they do.
got to be offended, and that's offensive enough.
Well, as I always like to say, if you're looking for white cars, you will see one on every corner.
It's right.
So it's just kind of the way it is.
True.
Jean agrees. Jean, you've been very quiet this meeting, Jean. She's always got something to add to our discussions.
I thank you so much for coming and joining us. The book is amazing. I agree with everything that's been said, and I do appreciate the way it was written and the context of the biblical quotes and the references, because that's who she was. That was what made her as a person. That was her education. That was what created how she thought. That was what bolstered how she thought. That was what allowed her to be alone in the world. Was that she had this faith in this overarching kind of sense of support from something other than everybody else who had pretty much either disappeared or given up on her. And, so to have taken that out would have left a very one-dimensional character.
Yes.
And it would not have been true to the time. And I think we have to be really cautious to, we're doing really a good job in this world of revising history.
Yes.
Ignoring what happened and saying, no, this is what we think happened, or this is what we want to say happened. And that's a really dangerous thing to do on so many levels. And if it starts in literature, it goes off everywhere else. So I'm really thankful for both of you to have not done that, because I think it's a dangerous precedent to allow that to be done.
Yeah, I agree. Well said.
Yeah, thank you, Jean. Beth, I think you'll be our final question.
Thank you again for coming. And Amy, this was a wonderful book. I know you said you're a history teacher. I don't know if you said, did you find Amy as part the heroine, Deborah, as part of your studies investigation, or did you seek a strong woman and find her, if you know what I mean?
The way I came across her, no, I did not come across her at all. Honestly, I think they're teaching her more now, but there was a big gap. And anybody that's around my age, unless you grew up maybe in Sharon or Middleborough, I did not know anything about Deborah Sampson. And it wasn't until she came across, I mentioned this at the first, maybe you missed that part about coming across her. I came across her story on the 4th of July.
Oh, right.
In 2021.
Right.
And so that was how I came across her. And I was like, I don't know who this is. And went down a rabbit hole.
Gotcha.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep.
You did say that.
Are there any other questions you guys want to ask Amy before we leave? Because the question I had, which is, I think we've already answered the last one, which was, marrying Jones, a big departure from the true story, and then her decisions around that, but she's already explained that. So I'm, you guys, you always do such a good job of, asking what I already have on my list. Yes, Miriam, you got another one.
Well, I always have another question. So you have Deborah Sampson be a descendant of Bradford, right? Bradford. For a Mayflower descendant. Is that
that's true?
Historically correct?
All of it's historically correct. Who Deborah was, and I found that to be so.
That is very cool.
Fascinating. And yet isn't it interesting that, here she is, her mother was the granddaughter, or maybe it was the great granddaughter. I'm losing it. But her mother was a Deborah also. So her mother was a Bradford, and so here it is, 3 or 4 lines down, 3 or 4 generations down, and Deborah Sampson is an indentured servant. There was absolutely no privilege that came with being a descendant of a Mayflower, one of these founding families, so to speak. They were poor. They had the same struggles. It's just really, really interesting. I thought, well, she certainly didn't benefit from being a Bradford, but her mother was very adamant of that. And this part was also true. Her mother and her father was a Sampson, and there was a Henry Sampson on the Mayflower as well. So all of that connection, I think she was also related to the Alden was also in her, is in her pedigree. So it was really interesting. And the part about William Bradford's first wife and the way she died in the harbor, just of despair. I mean, all of that is true. And all of those things were such wonderful threads in writing Deborah's character, because there was so much truth that I was able to rely on to form the story and to build it. So yeah, 100%.
Thanks. Looks like you have one more there.
Oh yes, I'm sorry, Diane. Yes, please. Gotta unmute. We can't hear you. Sorry.
That's because I'm muted. Sorry. Just a quick question. I love the book. And, you know, as you write, you create this person in your mind, and they become full-fledged, and they're sort of like a haunting person. But then you always wonder how close, how congruent that is with the real person. And I'm wondering if you heard from any of her descendants and what their feedback was. And then I also wondered if they'd be eligible for the DAR based on her service.
Yeah, they should be, right? I've
Yeah.
actually heard from three people that were Sampson descendants, and they are so far have been absolutely thrilled. They've been thrilled with the fact that her story is being told the way it was told. And I'm always a little bit scared when I open up an email that comes through my website, you know, that fan mail or not fan mail, depending on, you know, who's writing. But I've had some wonderful letters from people that were like, she's in my line. Or just recently, a woman wrote to me, and it was her husband his middle name was Samson. And she didn't know much about, she says, I knew that he had an ancestor that fought in the revolution, a woman that he told me about, but he didn't know much about her story beyond, you know, I had this ancestor that dressed up as a boy and fought in the war. And she actually read the story after he'd passed and realized that this was the story that her husband had held on to and that had been passed down. And his middle name was, again, they'd given him the middle name Samson to hold on to that, you know, heritage. She just, you know, he didn't know much, and she just remembered the story and then read the story after, and it was just such a lovely letter, a lovely connection. She says, I felt so and his nickname was Spider, which is so funny. She says, I just felt so close to Spider reading this and realizing that this was his family connection. And I've had one from her last name also was Sampson. Her father had purposely not given her a middle name because he had 3 daughters and they were the last of one of the Sampson, you know, of the line, and he didn't want them to lose the Sampson name. And so she had used it all of her life, Sampson, you know, whatever, I can't remember what her married name was, but she was in her 70s, but was just really thrilled about the fact that, you know, there was this story finally about this woman that that her family had held on to and had revered. And so, and then there was one more, and I'm trying to remember the specifics, but yes, I have. And every time I breathe this huge sigh of relief, because, you know, there might be somebody that is upset, but I don't think so. I think if you've read the book, and you know enough about her to just think, you know, this was a total labor of love. And it was a labor of love on my part. I wanted her story to be known, and I felt really close to her. And it wouldn't surprise me if I started to do my own genealogy and somehow I find her up there somewhere, because I just felt really close to her the entire time and felt like she wanted me to write it. I felt like that from the beginning. So
And
a
you
little
can tell.
spirituality.
Carol, quickly, because I have to close out. Okay, mute.
I just wanted to say that when someone did mention the quotes, there were so many that I have, and I was wondering also if they were yours, but there was one quick thing I just thought of. Every year Sharon does a 1 book, 1 town read. And I was on the committee last year, and I think this would probably be a great choice for next year. So get in touch with me.
I'll send you her data.
That'll be great. I'll send you a box of books. How about that? And that would be a fun thing.
Okay.
Thank you, Carol. So Amy, last question was, what's coming next? What's your next one you got working on?
The next book is called The Outlaw Noble Salt, and it is loosely, it's not even based, it's inspired by Butch Cassidy. He is from where I live. He's just was born and raised over the hill from where I was born and raised. And I have always been fascinated with Butch Cassidy. And so it kind of picks up where the movie Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, where there's a period where he has kind of an interesting story. They don't know if Butch Cassidy died the way that the movie portrays and the way that history tells. And so I thought I'm going to write this story. And he was absolutely as fun to write about as, well, more fun in some ways, because Deborah's was so heavy. But it was, yeah, that's what's coming next. And it'll be out and it's got a love story too. So, you know, I stick with my, yeah, they all do. But it'll be out in April of 2024. It's finished and with the editor, and I just got cover samples today. So,
oh, good.
Yeah.
Well, we look forward to that one. All right. And so I'm going to thank you, because if the gals want to chat for a little bit, I'm going to stop.
Sure.
Recording. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you.
We really appreciate it. And like I said, we just love